All right, we'll call to order the meeting for the Planning Commission, City of Oregon City, January 13th, 2025. I'll start off with a roll call, please.
Commissioner Dole.
Here.
Commissioner Laws.
Here.
Commissioner LaSalle.
Here.
Commissioner Schlagenhofer.
Here.
Vice Chair Espy.
Here.
Chair Stoll.
Here. Move on to item 2, election of officers. It's the first meeting in January, and per the city code, we need to elect chair and vice chair. So we'll open the floor to nominations for chair.
One. I would like to nominate Commissioner Espy as chair.
Can't Commissioner Stoll do it for another year?
It's a big year coming up.
I'll second that nomination.
Okay. All right.
No,
Nomination's been made and seconded. Any other nominations? All right, call the vote, please.
Commissioner Dole.
Aye.
Commissioner Laws.
Aye.
Commissioner LaSalle.
Aye.
Commissioner Schlagenhofer.
Aye.
Vice Chair Espy.
Aye.
Chair Stoll.
Aye. Motion passes, and it's all yours.
Please, Mr. Custer.
I was like, that was scripted.
It's funnier this way.
Congratulations.
Do we also need a vice chair?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry?
I think now we need a vice chair.
Right, I'll nominate Commissioner Dole.
Oh.
Second.
I'll call the roll. Call the roll? Is that
Call the vote for that? Okay.
motion made and seconded? So,
Commissioner Dole.
Aye.
Commissioner Laws.
Aye.
Commissioner LaSalle.
Aye.
Commissioner Schlagenhofer.
Aye.
Vice Chair Chair Espy.
aye.
And Commissioner Stoll.
Aye.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, can you hand this to Chair SP? Thank you.
Okay, so the next item we have on the agenda is approval of the minutes.
Thanks.
I move to approve the minutes of November 18th, 2024. Second.
Okay, so it's moved by Chair LaSalle, seconded by Dirk Schlagenhofer. Roll call.
Commissioner Dole.
Aye.
Commissioner Laws.
Aye.
Commissioner LaSalle.
Aye.
Commissioner Schlagenhofer.
Aye.
Commissioner Stoll.
Aye.
Chair Espy.
Aye. Okay, so the next item we have is for public comments, and I have one speaker slip for Jim Nacita.
Thank you, Chair SB, Planning Commissioners. I debated with myself whether I should come up here and make the comments that I want to make, but I thought the better part of valor would be to raise the concern in case, then rather let time pass, and if passing time makes potential corrections not feasible anymore, I thought it would be more responsible to raise a concern earlier than later. And the concern I have comes down to a simple issue. I really think that the Tumwater Village Master Plan Amendment application should be a legislative proceeding, not a quasi-judicial proceeding. The notice I got in the mail because I'm a neighboring property owner. This is clearly a notice for a quasi-judicial land use proceeding. The reason I think it's a legislative proceeding is that the original Willamette Falls Master Plan was adopted by ordinance. So all the amendments that are being requested in that land use proceeding that's scheduled for the 27th, they're really asking for an amendment to that ordinance. So to me, that makes the proceeding a legislative proceeding, not a quasi-judicial proceeding. That has implications, for example, the 120-day rule, ex parte contact, bias, et cetera, et cetera. I think that magnitude of a decision, and whether it goes to the city commission by right, which I think is the key issue, as opposed to paying for an appeal. But decision of that magnitude, I think the city commission really needs to hear. And because, like I say, the amendments being requested are amendments to the ordinance, which I attached to what I sent today. But I didn't think of it until after I sent it. So anyway, I'm going to memorialize these concerns and send them to you and to the commission. But just in case you wanted to do something with it well in advance, rather than, because I don't even think your next meeting is till the 27th when you hear that public hearing. I just thought, it would be a responsible thing to do, just to express the concern and let you all deal with it as you see fit. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nocita. I guess the question I would have right off the bat is, how far along are we on this one, and has the noticing been done on it yet, or any of that?
Yes, the noticing has been done. So we're in the midst of finishing up the staff report, the conditions and analysis and findings. Yeah. And then we would publish it on Friday, actually. We have to publish it early because of the holiday. Yeah. We can go back and look at what Mr. Nocita is referring to, but from my understanding, it's quasi-judicial because it's not changing anything that's in the code. Uh-huh. It's not, there aren't any proposals, from what I understand, to change any language or zoning or comprehensive plan amendment, which are typically what gets changed by a legislative amendment. And that is what was originally a part of the original application. There was multiple things that were changed at the same time. But this would be just the master plan portion, which is Chapter 1765, that applies to private property. So we can go back and double check that what they're proposing to change won't actually affect any of those other pieces. But I'm fairly certain we would have caught that by now, but we'll go back and check that.
I don't think we as a commissioner, as me anyway, I'll speak for myself, I don't even want to wade into that. I would want to defer to y'all or the city attorney to make that determination. Usually it's related, legislative is for, more policy, broad-reaching policy for, kind of a large swath of territory, whereas, a quasi-judicial is a more focused zone change, comp plan amendment on a smaller area. But that's kind of squishy, and it just depends upon, what the context is, I guess. So I would really want to rely on you and the city attorney to come up with the right.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And so we'll reach out to Carrie Richter and see if she can produce an opinion on that. But you are correct that there sometimes is a quasi-judicial zone change when it's just for one piece of property, but...
yeah, if you just have one small piece or a couple of pieces, I think that you can get away with doing a quasi-judicial as opposed to legislative.
Right.
Especially if you're just changing, especially if you're just changing something from from one zone to another, or especially in that same kind of land use category or whatever. If you're changing, something from commercial to residential or vice versa, I suppose that would be something different, but I don't want to belabor it. I'll await the answer, or we will anyway, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so our next discussion item would be any discussion items. Is there any discussion items from staff or?
Yes, so tonight, kind of the main reason why we're here is to talk about our favorite topic, climate-friendly and equitable communities. And we're pushing this forward now and getting going. I was just being a little flippant, I guess. When I presented this to the City Commission about a year ago, everyone in the room left, so they weren't really interested in the topic. But we're back tonight, and so we're starting on our public engagement processes, and so this is kind of just to get your initial feedback and talk through some of the pieces that, first of all, talk through the direction that we're going as directed by the City Commission, and then talk through the requirements that we need to make, and then some of the options where we can make some choices. So, so we have our consultant here. So this is Brian Davis. Right, thank you, sorry. And he is helping us get through this process. So that's how you know that we're serious this time, where we've engaged the services of a consultant. So, and he's got a presentation that he'll walk you through.
Excellent.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I guess I'm here to do two exceedingly important things this evening. One is to actually make parking interesting so nobody leaves the room.
Too late.
Hopefully we can at least do that. And the second, and quite frankly, the real, I'm revealing a trade secret here. The key to my business model is I'm here to take any incoming fire on the necessity and wisdom of the CFEC rules so that DLCD, who is paying me, does not have to. Yeah, so maybe this is kind of familiar stuff to you, but in 2007, Oregon passed some fairly high-minded climate goals, reducing pollution, 75% by 2050. We are not on track to do that as of 2022, and particularly the transportation sector, I think, has lagged behind in terms of cleaning up its environmental footprint. And so as part of that, the LCDC, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, directed DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, to adopt changes in the state's planning rule. There are a number of them. Some of them just kind of go right over my head, but yeah, I'm here to talk about parking, and of course, a big chunk of that is some new rules that kind of pretty significantly restrict what you as a city within a metropolitan area can require and cannot require with regard to parking. I'm probably aiming at the wrong thing. Why not? Oh, okay. There we go. Yeah, so what we're doing here tonight, we just kind of want to get your very high-level feedback on the direction and the approach, as Aquila said. We're not asking you to make any decisions tonight. That will come later. So we'll just talk a little bit at a high level about the CFEC requirements, the various options to compliance that cities throughout the state are taking, the recommended approach for you based on, the initial kind of round of feedback that predated me from City Commission primarily, but also we convened toward the end of last year an ad hoc committee, mostly folks, I guess the standard issue neighborhood advocates and representatives from neighborhood associations, those sorts of groups, to get some initial feedback regarding some areas where there are decisions to make. So want to present some of that to you and get your take on it and talk about the next steps here. So yeah, essentially, with regard to parking, there are several things that the new administrative rules require. The key piece of that is one of three options for parking reform. The first option, the one that actually most jurisdictions in the state are taking, are to remove all parking minimums citywide. The second option, option two, is to choose from a menu of fairly significant parking reforms and interventions. The third option is to enact several, fairly prescriptive set of, I would say, less significant interventions that are just kind of designed to, manage things holistically in a climate-friendly way, I suppose. We can go back and forth on how those are structured and whether that accomplishes that. But that's a key piece of what this whole process is kind of taking these things that are, required at a state level, assuming Oregon City wants to, I guess, continue to be a city in Oregon and get all of the funding related to that. How do we do that, or what does the state require there, and how do we do that in a way that is, maximally consistent with Oregon City's planning goals, economic development goals, those sorts of things? That's been kind of the crux of our work so far in the initial conversations we've had with the ad hoc committee, and as we kind of transition into a more robust outreach program here in January going into February, those are going to be kind of the key questions that we ask of you, the other committees, and the citizens who we're reaching out to as well. I also should mention that, parking minimums, even if we elect to keep them in the code, would not apply in a fairly large swath of the city. The area that is within the 1/2 mile buffer of TriMet Bus Line 33, as that's a frequent service line, and then the designated climate-friendly area of downtown, which I think there's mostly overlaps with the Line 33 buffer, but maybe there's a few extra areas wrapped into that. So a fairly big chunk of the city would not have parking minimums regardless of the decision here. And then the bottom piece of that slide there are the other major piece of these requirements. So kind of two pieces of the puzzle. The first being the parking reform piece and the three options. The second piece are a fairly prescriptive set of improvements to the design of parking that does get constructed. So we're talking about things like adding landscaping requirements. A lot of your code already has landscaping requirements for parking, so these would just be relatively minor tweaks, but some other substance there. You have the option from the state of doing solar panels in lieu of landscaping. You also have the option of doing a fee and loop program instead of requiring either landscaping or solar panels. So we could talk a little bit about that and what that would look like as well. And there's some requirements that we have to meet regarding EV parking. Parking maximums have to be put in place in all of the same areas where parking minimums cannot be, namely the climate-friendly areas and that 1/2 mile buffer from Line 33, and a couple small items of bike parking. These are mostly things that are going to go into effect when you update your transportation system plan. So, there's a map here of the exempt areas here that your staff put together. You can see the line, the dark line kind of running through the middle is the route of Line 33, and then the 1/2 mile buffer around that, and including the climate-friendly areas you can see in the bubble there. So essentially, those are the areas where you are not allowed to enforce any parking minimums and where you have to put in place parking maximums for certain uses. I think primarily residential, multifamily is where the parking maximums have to go in. There I think are already maximums in your code. I forget exactly how those stack up with what the state is requiring, but by and large, there's going to be some small adjustments there, but nothing too significant. I think the big one is with regard to multifamily requirements. Based on the initial work that happened before I got here, the city commission, city staff preferred option 3 as the compliance route. The reason, as near as I can understand for that preference, it always strikes me when I came to Oregon City, particularly, I haven't been before this commission since you have relocated to this building, and I'm always struck by how Oregon City is completely one context down the hill and downtown, and it's a heck of a lot more rural in feel and character when you get up here. I think because of that, commission strongly preferred that it's appropriate to maintain the minimums in this part of the city, although I guess we're within the Line 33 buffer, but the outlying areas that are not covered by that, it's appropriate to maintain those parking minimums, whereas the transit accessible areas in the downtown area are going to be a little bit less reliant on the parking, so easier to remove them there. There are some things within option 2 that are just going to be very hard to implement if we took that route, and would be very hard to kind of monitor over on a continual basis. Namely, one of the requirements there, if you took option 2, is the idea of unbundling parking, which is to say if I rented an apartment from new construction there, they would not be allowed to give me the parking space as part of the monthly rent de rigueur. They would have to unbundle that and allow me the option to either rent a parking space or decline to rent a parking space as a separate line item. So that's kind of the key feature of option 2. I think both city commission and city staff thought that there were enough questions regarding implementation of that we kind of went to option 3 as sort of the path of least resistance there. So what is option 3? As we discussed, no parking minimums within half mile of frequent transit and regional centers. There are no parking, you're not allowed to require parking citywide for certain specific uses. Things like affordable housing, I think, was one of the key ones that they wanted to make sure was exempt on a citywide basis. There are a couple other uses as well. No additional parking required for changes in use and expansions. And I think one of the key requirements, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why option 3 makes sense for Oregon City, you're required to have a paid parking district and or residential parking area, and you already do. So, so right off the bat there, one of the key pieces of implementation there is already a box that can be checked. So, in essence, option 3, we feel, and sounds like city commission feel, makes the most sense. It's also kind of an interesting note, not that it really should affect the decision too much, but Oregon City is the first and potentially only city that is choosing option 3. And that's actually, I think DLCD is pretty supportive of that as well, because, from their perspective, they like to see that the jurisdictions are choosing the various options that they have laid out there as, for compliance. So, just in terms of getting the various approvals and that sort of thing, option 3 makes a lot of sense. So how does that look? Again, prior to now, we've kind of had some initial outreach. First, primarily staff was doing it, reaching out to city commission to get that general direction. Again, once I was brought on board, we convened an ad hoc committee that was designed for the purpose of, advising this, kind of shaping things before we take it to you and to the other commissions, and just kind of providing direct sort of fairly in the weeds feedback regarding the specifics of implementation. Moving forward here, this is the beginning of our broader outreach process to the various city commissions. Obviously, the Planning Commission is going to play a key role as we move from outreach now into the next month toward adoption in March, April, and May, because this is, I think, a type 4 legislative process. All of the fun that goes with that, including a recommendation from this commission to take to city council, or the city commission rather, and then it would go through that process through City Commission to adopt the legislative amendments. So the long and short of that, so the required changes here, a little bit hard to see. We tried to get this as legible as possible. I'll blow this up even further in the next slide deck. So yeah, a few kinds of universes of key changes here. The first being the parking minimums. We talked about those. So yeah, a little bit more detail than kind of the overview I presented earlier. In addition to areas adjacent to, or rather within this half-mile buffer of line 33, we are no longer allowed to have parking requirements for several apartment types and mixed-use developments. Some of these are reductions rather than eliminations of minimums altogether. Bars and taverns, they don't like parking requirements there. And additionally, certain other types of developments, historic buildings, commercial properties, development seeking LEED certification, those sorts of things. Parking mandates reduced for developments that include certain climate-friendly features like solar wind power capacity, EV stations, accessible units beyond the minimum required. Those sorts of things. Then we have various improvements to parking design, including, landscaping, pedestrian connections, those sorts of things. Again, some of these are already required within the city code. Some of them are not required exactly within the city code, but it's pretty close. So just certain tweaks will be required here and there. In a lot of cases here, I've tried making notes to speak to that to the right there. For instance, you currently have landscaping requirements that meet the requirements of CFEC to a T, except for the fact that you lack a single number of whatever the tree canopy should be, and DLCD specifies what that number is. I think it's 40% lot coverage or whatever. So, so there are some potential ways we can kind of shape this regarding the path of least resistance, which would just be really keeping the code as it is and just adopting a 40% minimum landscaping requirement there. Or you could kind of tweak the rules and, give developers a solar option or give developers a fee in lieu option. Those are things that the developers tend to find pretty friendly, just in terms of making things work within the spatial constraints, whether you want to or not is a decision for this commission as well as the other folks who will have, a say before this is all said and done. And then, there's some fairly prescriptive things about bike parking requirements, many of which you already do. A lot of it is requiring, parking at certain quote-unquote key destinations, which are defined fairly specifically by the new administrative rules. A lot of those are, there are a few code updates that need to happen in terms of making sure the development code is consistent with the CFEC rules, but a lot of this 630 bike parking requirement piece is part of or is designed to be implemented when you next update your TSP. So I think you guys are beginning of that process pretty quick here. So part of that, there's going to be certain bike parking pieces that have to be considered there. We'll make sure we get you recommendations for that by the end of this. But a lot of that won't be part of these code updates. So this is where, the meat of the conversation is, or the protein mains if you're vegetarian. Bean-based protein mains if you're vegetarian, I guess. Key decision points. So I've narrowed this into 5 basic universes, and really EVs sort of are not. There's not really too much to address here, but so there's 5. They'll call it 4.5 areas where we have been, really kind of picking the brains of the ad hoc committee in terms of trying to get feedback, and where we're going to continue to focus our feedback efforts here as we bring this to you and the other commissions. The first being, there is a requirement that you allow This is a pretty direct quote, underused on and off-street parking spaces to be redeveloped for other purposes, including the purposes that we see there could be turned into bicycle parking, bus stops, park and rides, or parklets. Those I think are mostly envisioned for on-street parking areas. Off-street parking areas would be turned into seating areas, food carts, and structure expansions. So, and those are just possibilities rather. So a couple things to think about there. One being there needs to be some mechanism in the code, I guess, to allow it for both on-street and off-street parking. On-street parking obviously is mostly going to be under the purview of the city, of Public Works or whatever. So how that gets converted to bicycle parking, bus stops, et cetera, would be, yeah, something that's largely in the hands of the city. We just need to make sure that, there's a mechanism that allows for that in the code. But again, that's more of a Public Works issue than a development code revision issue. The key piece where the development code needs to be revised is to allow for this for off-street parking areas. So I guess the classic example would be a restaurant that has way too much parking or more parking than it needs, more parking than it thinks it needs, because part of the definition of unused is kind of left fairly vague, and DLCD indicated that it sort of wants property owners to have their own, or be able to imply their own definition of underused. So, so theoretically, if a restaurant owner had 10 parking spaces more than they needed, they would be able to redevelop that, I think as a right without a further judicial process, right? So there's obviously concern from the city, from the community in terms of making sure that the code is structured in a way that you don't have unwanted development there. So the example that came up, I think, in our last outreach meeting, there are, say a bar owner, a food court owner, wanted to develop a few food carts on their parking lot. You already have code that speaks to where, how, when food carts can get developed. How do we structure this to fit in with that code, but still meet the letter of the state requirements? So these are some conversations that we've been actively having, and I've been having on the other end with DLCD to make sure I understand the requirements there. How do we structure this to, maintain the maximum amount of, ability from your commission, from city commission, to ensure that there's just not unwanted development, things that are contrary to, the spirit of your zoning laws going on there while still maintaining that requirement. And if anyone has strong opinions on any of these, feel free to interrupt me and start talking about it. Yeah, please.
Yeah, you definitely got me thinking about this one. The underused off-street parking. And you make it sound like a property owner can kind of self-determine if they're underused or not. So let's say someone has a whiskey bar, but they don't have any food, and they got this parking lot, and they think, I can put a couple of food carts in here. I'm going to, self-explain that nobody's using these parking spots, even though they use them all the time, but we're going to pretend they don't. And now they got some food carts. There is no longer parking. Now the parking is in the street, and the property owner is making more money. What prevents that? Is there any way to prevent every parking lot owner from just expanding their business? Because I see it also says expansions, so you can technically expand basically anything if the property owner says they're not using the parking spots.
Yeah, that's a good question, and my understanding of it is that is essentially correct. Yeah, so and that's where we can kind of go back to DLCD and get clarification on that too. What I'm unclear about, is this: what's the definition of underused? So DLCD is clear that it kind of wants to give property owners the latitude to determine that, but where I wonder if there may be some room for the planning commission is maybe in the code updates we can kind of put a burden, we can specify what underused means to you and put a burden on the property owner to establish that before they pull permits for, for building the food carts and repurposing the parking or whatever as well. But I do think that's a fairly valid concern there, and that there's not a lot you could do, especially when you combine that with the other things. Like you said, an expansion is not going to require more parking now. Redevelopment or a change of use is not going to require new parking, even if it's something that's more intensive in terms of parking generation on a square foot basis. So,
I'll add one more thing, and this just kind of keeps growing, but as an Oregon administrative rule, how hard is that? How hard is that line? I mean, can we say this just doesn't work for Oregon City, or are we 100% legally bound by these rules? Do we lose grants? What happens if we say this is just bad for our city? You don't understand our city. We're just not going to do it. Well, what happens in that case?
Yeah. So big picture. So this is part of 405, right? 405 is the administrative rule that is intended to, speak to existing parking lots or new parking lots that may be redeveloped. And, and so this is what 405(1)B, and I'll read it to you. Property owners shall be allowed to redevelop any portion of existing off-street parking areas for bicycle-oriented and transit-oriented facilities, including bicycle parking, bus stops and pullouts, bus shelters, parking ride stations, similar facilities. So shall be allowed to redevelop any portion of existing off-street parking areas. That's what you got to do. I don't know what the penalty is if you don't do this, whether it's, you get thrown out of the state or just get nasty letters from DLCD or what. But I'll run this back up the food chain to Evan at DLCD, but shall be allowed to redevelop any portion of off-street parking areas. It feels like there's a way to meet that where you're not basically throwing your entire development code under the bus and letting them do whatever.
Okay, no, I think that's a good enough explanation. I'll let you continue. That was just my feeling on that.
Yeah, but thanks for the feedback. A key piece of this is to get that as well, and concerns insofar as you have them, so we can kind of, inspect that, get into what the letter of the law is, what it requires, where there might be wiggle room, and I can bring this again back to DLCD, kind of have that feedback loop there and see what's what we could do, what is required, what is a little more optional.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Laws.
Real quick, with the fires going on in LA, my great aunt lived there at one point down back, she was born in 1896, lived in Hollywood at one point. A lot came to mind. I live in the historic parts of Oregon City. I think I went to one of the meetings. My house is 1916. My neighborhood, before I moved there, did the 2-hour parking because at one point Par Lumber was up the end of the street. We have a bus stop probably around the corner. We have had a restaurant around the corner. We had, at one point Par Lumber's become like a DHS building or whatever. The neighbors came in together, did a 2-hour parking at the end because neighbors couldn't have gas. Some neighbors don't have driveways, so the whole historic part does deal with homes that some neighbors just don't have driveways. So they can't park if, they don't have somewhere on the road to park, or they have to walk blocks, or a business may have their business come by, like DHS, and then all their employees will take all the residential parking away. So that 2-hour parking saves residents, so that they can get a permit from the police department so that they can park in front of their house. And if they're disabled, or so they can get to their house. So I do think under certain circumstances, there needs to be an exception in some form, especially for people who have needs to get to their house. I also, because there's not a lot of houses that have driveways. I would say at least a third of the houses, or a good amount, don't have driveways in the historic parts. I also think that, my street and others in the historic parts are really narrow, and visibility, like kids play in the street, you can't see them. We do have to worry about safety and visibility, and the more we look at this, it's going to be harder to see people, and it's going to be harder to get out. And there's parts of the city, like we're looking at, it's really hard to get out, and the more we look at this, we're going to have to look at safety and fire hazard and, like how to get out, how to see people. So that's something to consider as well. So just mentioning that.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, are you talking about the daylighting? Yeah, this is... Yeah, so you may be aware there's something we're dealing with in Portland. It's actually a huge topic of conversation. The state law theoretically requires intersections to be daylit or whatever, and Portland sort of knowingly ignores that because there are neighborhoods where you just can't take away those parking spaces. They'll be at City Hall with torches and pitchforks tomorrow. So that it's unsatisfying, or there's going to be an unsatisfying answer, but that's kind of more of a management consideration than anything that's going to be addressed in the code updates. That said, I agree with you wholeheartedly and wish that when we thought about parking management, we thought a little bit more carefully about these overlaps of safety issues and the functionality of the system at the same time. Now, insofar as this process impacts that, I do think it's probably fair to say that in the long term, probably not immediately, but in the long term, you are going to see the burden of parking shifting from private lots, driveways, that sort of thing, to a greater piece of that is going to be handled on the street, and in public facilities and that sort of thing, and that's going to kind of increase the burden on the city to do this sort of proactive management to keep the corners clear and that sort of thing. But again, that's part of a different process. And I think you guys are doing some management stuff on a parallel track, right?
In certain parts of the city. So if you're referring to some of the permit parking, that's a little bit closer to the downtown. So not really in your historic neighborhood, but closer to downtown. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything else before we move on? Does anyone have other opinions on this idea of developing underused parking?
Would it be allowed for us to require an actual parking study to be done by the applicant in order to prove that it's underused?
So that's kind of what I was getting at. I'm not even going to try to say your name, but the commissioner to your right's question. That's something that's exactly what I was thinking when I was saying, you could establish some sort of burden that the property owner then should meet. I'm not sure if that's legal or not. I'll have to go back to DLCD and ask, but that would be, to me, a technically good way of doing that is, it should be below a certain percentage of occupancy a certain amount of the time. You have to show that with a parking study before you can pull your permits. The problem is, I don't know if there's, what would be the mechanism to trigger that? If it would be, usually that would be during a land use process, but I don't think this contemplates allowing a land use process. So could there be a trigger before they pull a building permit or whatever? Would they even need a building permit for some of the things contemplated here? So that's a good question, and these are things we'll get to,
another
some
question.
better answers for.
I'm looking at the OER section right now, and I can't find it because there's 60 different options. But What is the definition of frequent transit?
It's at every 15 minutes.
Okay. So right now on line 33, and I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, there's 8 buses on line 33. If we can get TriMet to drop that to 6, then we don't have to deal with this, right?
No, that is not accurate.
Well, I mean, I should say that frequent transit doesn't matter, or it doesn't
That's
apply.
true, yeah. Yeah, the buffer wouldn't matter. And then all the other code requirements
Sure.
would still apply,
Yeah.
but yeah.
I'm just going to say that it's absurd that the transit district gets to decide where our housing code applies and doesn't apply. That is just blows my mind that gets outsourced to a transit district. But anyway, thanks.
Yeah, anything else on this particular piece? So the next, the next level of, the second row there, still pertains to 405, and in particular, the landscaping requirement. This has been an interesting topic, not just here, but I think throughout the state as, cities implement this. So you need to do at least one of the following things, but you could do any combination of them or all three. The first, as I said, is landscaping with certain requirements, including a 40% tree canopy, and a handful of other requirements that your code already meets. The second option there would be allowing a number of spaces. I'm sorry, I had a weird line break there, I just noticed, but tree canopy covering at least 40% of the new parking area at maturity. Again, that's not the only tree canopy requirement in the administrative rules. There are others, but your current code meets that. So the only thing we would need to add is the tree canopy. The second one is solar panels that are able to produce, I forget exactly what it is, but certain amount of power per parking space. And then the third option would be to charge a fee of at least $1,500 per parking space in the lot in lieu of complying with either of these options. So in other words, if I'm a developer, I have to, you can give me the option of complying with any one or all three of these or whatever. So if you choose all three, I would either have to pay a fee in lieu that you had said, it's just got to be greater than $1,500 per parking space and not do landscaping and not do solar, or I could do solar, or I could do landscaping, or presumably I could do a little bit of solar and a little bit of landscaping. So those are the three options there. Any thoughts on that? Any strong feelings one way or another on any of that? Or any questions about that?
So I think if there was going to be an in lieu fee, there would need to be some kind of a threshold or something for them to overcome so that people don't just automatically default to
How do you envision that structure?
I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head.
Gotcha.
Are you suggesting that that would be like the last choice?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so it should be a kind of an order of priority, providing the canopy cover or the landscaping or...
Yeah. And one thing we could do there is, you're not obligated if you don't want to allow a fee in lieu option. If you did want to, but just to preserve that flexibility if site constraints were legitimately making it difficult to impossible for landscaping or solar requirements to be met, what you could do is have that fee be fairly high.
I was just a little confused. Is there any time when the charging stations for electric vehicles kick in?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Is there at any point where the charging stations for electric vehicles, when is that required? Is that
Yeah,
an
so
option
that
for you,
is, If I go to the next slide there, that's kind of the top line. So, yeah, electric vehicle charging is required for 40% of parking spaces, and I think that's only residential developments.
Okay.
There might be a requirement as well for mixed-use commercial developments. But yeah, what is it? More than 5 units for residential developments, you need to require 40% of those spaces. And the way that's worded is it just has to have the conduit to be a charging.
Build it.
Yeah.
Yeah, just had that.
So you don't actually have to have a plug yet, just the ability to put in a plug later.
All right. Can I add something to that? What if the development has 0 parking spots? 40% of 0 is 0.
Correct.
So you wouldn't have to put any electric parking in.
Correct.
That doesn't work.
Can you go back one slide?
Yep.
So I just wanted to mention with this, the bottom one, the 04054, where we have the 3 choices. Our ad hoc committee strongly suggested that we just eliminate the fee in lieu altogether as an option. I wanted to leave it in our presentation so that the public that we're presenting to knows what all the options are, but that group felt pretty strongly that it should not be an option at all. Yeah. And so I did hear a question the other day that I just want to clarify what this fee in lieu is, because we currently have a fee in lieu set up for street tree removal, and that's basically saying you can't, if you need to take your tree out and for some reason you cannot replant anywhere, then you can pay this fee in lieu. This idea is completely different. This is not paying to not replant. This would be paying instead of planting or solar panels. So it's a little bit of a different construct, but I just wanted to bring it up that our ad hoc group maybe felt a little more strongly than Chair Espy with the suggestion of making it the last option, and they just didn't want it presented at all. So we'll carry that feedback forward so that the decision makers know that, but I want to leave it out there so people know what the choices are.
I can easily echo those sentiments. I was just being, charitable, I guess.
On the bottom of that slide, it says fee in lieu of at least $1,500 per parking space into a clean energy. Are there words missing from that sentence?
Yeah, that's the awkward line break I didn't see till now.
Okay. What's the rest of that sentence?
The word missing is fund.
Fund.
Yeah, so,
a city-controlled fund or some other fund, or?
if you want, yeah, good question. So, the state leaves that up to your discretion. So there is, I think they reference a state-controlled fund that does not actually exist yet. They're in the process of establishing it. But yeah, you are welcome to establish one as a city or build it into presumably an existing, pot or universe that you already have and use put the money into that pot. But yeah, that's, I'm not even sure what they have legally that restricts or where you're allowed to spend it versus what you're not, but clean energy fund kind of pretty.
That was my next question, yeah. Okay. Cool, thank you. Oh, and I'm totally in favor of the fee in lieu. I want to disrupt this whole thing as much as possible. The top-down governance is just absurd. So I strongly disagree with removing the fee in lieu.
Commissioner Laws.
Any type of fees, sorry. If we got fees, obviously, for, contributing to anything type of environment green, would it go into the general fund or would it go into?
No, I don't think it would.
Like, where would it go, just out of curiosity?
Well, and so kind of going back to what Commissioner Stoll asked and what Brian was saying, the OAR specifies that the payment, the fee in lieu would go, it would be at minimum $1,500 per parking space, and then it would go into a city or county fund dedicated to equitable solar or wind energy development, or a fund at the Oregon Department of Energy designated for such purpose. Right. So the expectation would be if we take a fee in lieu, that we have a set-aside special fund, and then I guess we're installing solar panels somewhere with that money.
Could it go for beautification for the city in terms of canopy, like on, different areas rather than, or it would have to go towards that?
I don't think so. I don't know if it could be split out. Like, let's say that we charged $3,000 for the fee in lieu, and we took the minimum of $1,500 and put it into this, what did they call it? Solar or wind energy development. And then we took the remainder and put it in a different fund. That's something we could ask, but I'm not sure that it could get split out. I think that it's pretty prescriptive about what we can do with that fee in lieu. So a lot of this work, a lot of this climate-friendly code amendments are extremely prescriptive. So we've got very little wiggle room, so.
Because if you look at certain species of trees that are becoming harder, we're losing them. Like if you're looking at the white oak, for instance, it actually is can actually prevent fires, in terms of, and actually, if they're hit, they do attract lightning, but they actually prevent fires. So it's like, it would be nice to contribute to those things throughout the city because they're native and they actually prevent, they bring canopy and shade and they actually prevent fires rather than, contribute to them. So anyways, it's just a thought, if we can actually bring in, canopy that's native that actually benefits the city in so many ways. But I don't know, it's just a thought.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so I think that we have a little bit of a consensus on going with option 3. I don't want to speak for anybody, but it seems as though option 3 is the best option, but I think there is a little bit of discrepancy between whether or not the in lieu fee would, be in or out, and that's fine. I would say that if we do an in lieu fee, I would agree that there would have to be a descriptive set of items of CFEC related items that fee would be allocated towards, and it'd almost be like a little miniature CIP kind of thing to, or a laundry list of things that they could fund, so that people knew where those fees were going, and having some sort of simple but transparent accounting for just what those fees would be used for.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I'm just reading you what the OAR says, and I don't know that we can do anything other than solar or wind energy.
Right. Okay, that's a very short
It's a good question that we could ask, and maybe I don't have a lot of experience in either of those fields, so maybe there are a lot of different projects you can do with those two things, but
then, I suppose you could have also a short list of locations for that, because I think there'd be more.
Correct.
There'd be some places where solar panels might be more appropriate, and other places where tree canopy would be more appropriate, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So might be some work to be done on where those areas would be. I don't know. Mr. Stoll.
I mean, the easiest thing to do would be to create a fund to do grants for citizens to install solar energy on their house. That would be fairly closed loop, I think. I'm not sure how you do an equitable solar or wind energy development. I'm not sure how you define that, but that's what it says. So I think that would be probably the easiest thing to do, although there would be administrative costs for that. But.
Sounds great.
Great, thank you, guys. Yeah, so EV charging, again, this is kind of like a half area. There's, I guess there's some wiggle room there, but a lot of it is, you know, we have to do what? I think it's 40% of parking spaces at new multi-unit residential, and I think it's 20% requirement for, for commercial. The big question there is, I guess the big questions there aren't really too many big questions, but do you want to go with those numbers as minimums? Do you want to increase those numbers and require more EV charging than that? One concern that came up in the ad hoc committee, we want to make sure that however this is designed, we're keeping any wires, any charging infrastructure clear of walking paths, and we're not introducing new accessibility concerns when we put in charging infrastructure. So the ad hoc committee wanted me to make sure that we're, making sure there's code provisions that say can't block walking paths with wires, that sort of thing. How do we do that? I think that's in code is a little bit of an open question. And there's also potentially opportunities, assuming we have a solar option for, as one of the options for parking lot design. Maybe there are ways to have the solar panel and the EV requirement kind of work together in tandem as part of, happy solar charged parking spaces. Like Aquila was saying, largely prescriptive there, but I guess some, if anyone has opinions on any of those matters, there's some room there to implement that in a way that, again, is just consistent with some of your broader goals in that regard.
I've got a lot to say about this one. And I know you can't answer all these, so I'm going to start first with a question. What's the status of our state's requirement for selling electric cars? I remember there was something about 2035, where we're supposed to be trying to only sell electric cars by 2035, or what was that? Was that California? Does Oregon have anything in the plans?
That's a good question. I'm not sure either.
Legislative session starts next week.
Okay, all right. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it sounds like we're designing cities and we're trying to, efficient use of space, efficient use of land, I understand that, but we're designing a lot of housing where people don't have their own parking spot, like one that they own. And you need that to be able to put in a car charger, because that's the only way to get it on your meter. And if you use the third-party chargers, like the Blink chargers, the ones in parking lots, and I've known people that use these because their apartment doesn't have chargers, they charge you 3 times as much for the electricity, and you end up getting 30 miles a gallon.
Right.
So if we're going to be building housing and we've got an electric vehicle, mandate coming someday, we got to give people the ability to charge their cars. And I'm not seeing how these development standards are considering that at all. It's like they're forgetting about it, or I don't see a way to fix it in the future if we don't address it now. That's my opinion on that. We may not have any answers today, but I see it coming, and it's confusing. I don't see an answer.
Yeah, some of it, and I'm not trying to put words in the DLCD's mouth here, just kind of interpreting their rules as well as I can. So typically, it's interesting. One thing that's come up is this is actually a little bit of an equity and access issue, because what we've seen in areas where there aren't requirements, the market housing, the luxury housing, those sorts of things are the ones that are built with parking above the minimums to potentially the maximums or near the maximums, because there's value in the parking space that, you know, you make a profit when you develop a driveway and resell that as part of a house. Lower income, multifamily, et cetera, that profit margin is lessened. So in those situations, there's more of an incentive to develop to the minimums, and when there's no requirement to develop little to no parking at all, because there's not a profit margin there the way there is with, you know, a wealthier house, right? So, so I guess the point is well taken, and that's something that, certainly we're looking at as we go through this process is how do we do all of these things that, you know, both meets the requirements of the state law, but also, is developing enough parking to where it's meeting the market need, and also giving people the options if they want to have an EV, if they don't want to have an EV, to be able to do that as well. So, point well taken. I think there's some flexibility there to kind of implement that and make sure we're not, you know, doing what you see coming, but to some extent, there's not a ton of flexibility there, honestly.
So, Commissioner Schlagenhofer, I think what I hear you saying is that if there's a multi-unit development that's got 50 units, and I'm not going to try to do the exact math, and we require that 40% of the parking spaces have EV, but then there's no actual requirement to match those parking space up with a unit, then somebody may live in a unit and own an EV car, but not be able to find the spot in their complex to charge it, I think is kind of what you're getting at. And so if they can't have like...
Unless we're a half a mile from a high-traffic bus line, and then there is no parking requirement.
Right, but...
Then there's zero chargers for 50 units.
Okay. So if there's a 50-unit development within the frequent transit corridor, they may develop parking or they may not. And so I hear what you're saying. So they may not have any parking. Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Thank you for hearing it.
Okay, so if they do develop parking, then they are required that 40% of the parking that they do develop have the infrastructure for EV charging, with the exception of the actual charger.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what the code is getting at, yeah.
Yeah, conduit and electrical capacity. Can we, not that I would want to, but just for the sake of argument, could we require the installation of the actual charging infrastructure?
I don't actually know why we couldn't.
Yeah, I can certainly get clarification from DLCD on that, but,
I'm looking at the OARs.
Sure sounds like you should.
It doesn't sound like there's a prohibition on that.
No.
Not that, I mean, that would perhaps disincentivize them to add parking, but I don't, you draw a line, people are going to be on whichever side of it is most advantageous, so.
Yeah, and my understanding, I think some of this is resolved in the last couple of years, but I know as recently as 21 or 22 or whenever they were finalizing the language, is where some of the technology goes over my head a little bit as a planner, but I think what that language is intended to do is there are multiple competing charging standards. I think there's a Tesla standard and an everyone else standard, and that's like Betamax and VHS in real time. And I think the state wanted to not require the actual charging infrastructure there, or rather not require the actual plug, to make sure that whatever wound up happening, and maybe there's still things changing. Again, I'm just not that abreast on the technology.
I can clarify that.
Yeah, please.
Teslas, pretty much any EV in the United States can plug into, like the chargers at Fred Meyer's. But Teslas are exclusive to the superchargers. So a Hyundai can't plug into a supercharger, but a Tesla can plug into any, I think it's a RJ, it's a RJ something number?
J1772.
Yes, thank you. So if we put those in, any EV could plug into it, but you couldn't plug a Tesla, you couldn't plug a Hyundai into a Tesla charger, so there'd be no point in wiring in a bunch of superchargers, but there is a standard for the entire United States on a charger that would work with every car.
Yeah, and the ORS specific to this 455.417 requires conduit for a level 2 charger, which is like a high amperage home-based charger, not a fast DC charger.
220 or...
Yeah, 220, 50 amp or less, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But yeah, that's, and again, I'll make sure of this, but I think that's definitely an option in front of you, is if you want to tweak that language, especially knowing what you do about the standards there, and require a specific thing, I think you're welcome to do that. Anything else on EVs for now? Of course, it's not your last opportunity. If you can always email me with longer form thoughts or whatever, we'll get it, get it incorporated into the work. And obviously, there's going to be other points of contact with this commission and the other commissions, the public, et cetera. But a couple more things to cover before I let you get on with your evening. Bicycle and small-scale mobility device parking in climate-friendly areas and key destinations. So a lot of this, at this point, I think, is informational, and this is sort of new. We kind of took some of the feedback we got from the ad hoc committee, and I had some conversations with DLCD over the last several weeks there, and that's where I kind of established, so there was a lot coming out of the ad hoc committee of questions regarding bicycle parking. Essentially, this rule requires you to provide certain parking meeting certain requirements at, quote, key destinations. Key destinations are defined in the administrative rules, nothing too surprising, things like schools, grocery stores, churches, transit centers, et cetera. There were a lot of questions regarding how we implemented that and that sort of thing, and the answer from DLCD is that a lot of this is just going to be required as part of your next TSP update, where presumably you would show, the on-street or the public realm bike parking and that sort of thing as part of that TSP. The area where it's a much smaller universe, where I think we're subject to the development code requirements are where something new is being put in. There are certain bike parking requirements that are required there. The key thing that came up in the ad hoc committee, there were a few people there, I think, or at least one person that rides a family bike or a cargo bike or something like that and can never find parking. And there's not a lot of specificity from the state on this, but how, or do we, and if so, how in the development code do we want to consider things other than the standard issue, street bike that quite frankly fewer and fewer people are using, at least for transportation purposes, and these are gradually getting replaced with bigger e-bikes and those sorts of things. Some of them can get into, or park next to an old staple. But I'm seeing more and more that are, just bigger types of vehicles. Again, anything that has cargo capacity or family capacity, it's going to be hard to get to, standard issue staple or anything. A lot of times there's vertical parking that, fits the requirements. Those are paying if you have a cargo bike or whatever too. So any thoughts on that? Do we want to contemplate that in the development code, having a percentage of bike parking spaces be accessible to family bikes or cargo bikes? You don't have to. You could just elect to leave well enough alone.
The city's built on the side of the hill. I mean, let's be realistic. The only real realistic thing would be e-bikes so that you don't have to pedal from downtown to, you know, to Holmes Lane, so.
You can put your bike on the bus, though.
Yeah, if you want to wait that long, or not wait that long, and then we wouldn't have to worry about it.
I usually end up picking up my wife at the library and dragging her up the hill, but.
You know, I've ridden up that hill. It's not that bad.
I've done it.
It's doable, but man, you need a shower by the end.
It's rough.
Yeah, I mean, those cargo bikes are pretty big. I know a few people that have those, and they do require. When it says not mopeds or motorcycles, we're not prohibited from requiring, say, moped or motorcycle parking. That's just not included in the small-scale mobile device definition. Is that, because I can't find the small-scale mobile device definition in the OARs. So is that what that means when it says but not mopeds or motorcycles?
Yeah, so I think what that is, and I don't think they actually provided a definition for that in the OARs, and they probably should have for a small-scale mobility device. I think, again, you know, it seems like there's more important than here, obviously, but every time I go downtown, it seems like there's a new scooter design or hoverboard or something, and I think they just wanted to have a catch-all term for that, for whatever the heck shows up on the sidewalk next week.
I'm just curious. I'm curious how that's defined, because it's just not in the definitions of OAR 660 in general, and I can't find it in 630, but I don't have time to look through the whole thing.
Yeah.
So.
You know, I think a big issue that they're trying to avoid too, again, we're seeing this a good bit in Portland. Fortunately, it's not as bad now as it was even a few years ago, but I don't want to create a situation where you have a bunch of scooters and stuff that are blocking sidewalks. So presumably by having places, presumably like on street, like corrals or corridors like that will hopefully, ideally, knock on all of this wood in this great room. That theoretically will keep them off the sidewalk more, hopefully. I don't know if that's a foolproof plan, but that's the intention.
Well, and we can double check that. I think what you're asking, Commissioner Stoll, is that we still have the ability to provide parking or require it for mopeds and motorcycles. So we can double check that
Gotcha.
Those are not included in this idea of small scale mobility.
I just wanted to make sure, since there's things that we can't require, I wanted to make sure that that wasn't one of the things that we couldn't require.
Right.
Because, I mean, it's a fairly efficient way to use space for folks that ride motorcycles and mopeds. And if you're interested in climate friendly, you know, I mean, motorcycles use less fuel, so.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a good question. We could ask if that falls. Well, it's an interesting. So are you thinking about requiring these or moped, motorcycle spaces, you know, like a percentage of them where parking is required, or?
I mean, you could fit more people's independent mobility that way.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, not prohibited. I just want to make sure it's not prohibited, I guess, is the.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To that end, I think it should be citywide as opposed to just multifamily too. For whatever that's worth.
Okay. Yeah, I can sure check on that as well. And again, I think coming back to the piece of 630 that's kind of not under the universe of this work, I don't know, certainly when you do the TSP process, and I've seen, there's a handful of cities throughout Oregon that I think are doing this, you know, where you have maybe a little bit of space here on the street, but not enough to stripe in a regular parking space. I've seen several cities on the coast are doing this, kind of doing smaller parking spaces than then signing it moped, motorcycle only. So, not really relevant to this work, but certainly something that you could think about when you go through the TSP update. Start thinking about the parking system in that context.
I got one really quick one. I won't drag it on. On OER 660-012-0410, we couldn't require a certain number of EV charging spots for a certain number of units. It has to be a percentage. We couldn't just say 1 for every 5 units. There's no way to work that.
I don't know. What's the advantage of doing it that way?
Then they have to put 1 in. As a percentage, if there's no parking, then there's no chargers. But if we said, okay, 1 for every 5, I understand it would be a minimum, but would the state law not allow that? Because I know it does say no minimums, but
yeah, I don't know.
No minimums for parking spots. But maybe if we call it a EV parking spot, we could somehow get around that.
Oh, okay.
We could make them put in an EV charging station.
Yes.
Without requiring the parking spot.
Right. But you need to leave space, a certain sized spot in front of it.
You're
that the car
charging,
happens to fit in.
the charging stations have these dimensions that happen to fit.
Yeah, clear space in front of it. That's perfect. I like that. Let's do that.
Okay.
Good work. I imagine they won't be too fond of that where in the climate-friendly areas where you can't enforce the minimums, but where you could legitimately do that is, the rest of the city outside that area where, if you're allowed to have minimums, you could also, instead of just saying 40%, you could restructure that minimum to be, certain number of EV spaces per unit in addition to or in lieu of a certain number of non-EV spaces, although maybe that's just a percentage thing. Yeah. Is that the same math? I have to check and see if they both produce the same numbers, but yeah, certainly an option in outside that 5-mile buffer. And then the last kind of decision piece. So you are required as what? Yeah, city of more than 25,000. That puts you in a special, class where in addition to having to, or not being able to have parking minimums inside the climate-friendly area and half-mile 5-mile buffer within line 33, you also have to implement parking maximums within those areas. And the question then becomes, should the now Oregon City already has parking maximums, and I think all but the multifamily, I believe all but the multifamily parking maximums are consistent with the with the CFAC requirements. So as part of this process, you will have to introduce a new multifamily parking maximum that is somewhat reduced. I think I have, currently your maximum is 2.5 spaces per units regardless of type, citywide. Within the transit proximity areas, you will have to reduce that to 1.2 spaces per unit for studio apartments and 2 spaces per any other non-studio unit. The question before you being both the Planning Commission and Oregon City as a whole is, do we want to just have, so do you want to apply that citywide, or do you want to keep your your maximum as it is citywide, which is the 2.5 spaces per unit, and just implement these new lower maximums in the transit proximity area? And I think that's really the only wiggle room in terms of how we structure compliance with this particular rule.
My only concern with having 2 different maximums would be just overall confusion on administering the code. And I would opt for either way a uniform number for that. I'm not sure how staff would feel about that, but that's how I'm leaning. And I'm clarifying. I'm making sure that we're not talking about existing parking. We don't have to fill in parking spaces if they're if the existing spaces are over the maximums, right? Because I know that in our shop, that question actually came up, and DLCD came back and said, yeah, you might have to reduce the number of parking spaces that are statically there if you are over those maximums, but I don't think that's true.
It's a good question. Are you thinking about a redevelopment scenario?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if someone went in to redevelop a residential development and had more than
Right.
that, 1.22 maximum, would they have to reduce the parking?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer.
I think we explored that, and then we found that we didn't have to do that. Or
Okay.
that didn't have to be done. And that would be, it'd just be non-conforming, but.
Yeah, it seems like you would have to allow a developer
Yeah.
that ability, but they would not have to be required, it wouldn't be a requirement.
Yeah.
Similar to the redevelopment of underused parking, they can if they find it underused, but they're not required to. I think this would kind of fall under that same umbrella.
Uh-huh.
Do you have thoughts on that?
No, I was just starting to look to see if there was any further clarification, but, yeah. I guess I was under the impression that all of these rules applied to new development, so, it's a question to explore about redevelopment.
Yeah.
Or what defines that?
Yeah. I don't think that would apply, but it'd be interesting to find out, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with Chair Espy on the uniformity across the whole city. The thought that came to mind on that was the buffer line. It's not going to be a hard and rigid line at property lines, so
Right.
I could see an instance where a property could straddle that line and, create some more confusion, as you were suggesting. So I'd be up for the uniformity.
Yep, it's just more of a, ease and administration kind of thing than anything else.
I just want to clarify the uniformity. You mean across the city, not by but not by unit type.
Correct.
Okay.
By the city.
Because I was going to say, if we're going to do uniformity between the studio or multi-bedroom, then we would by default have to go to 1.2, which is too low.
That does make sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Misunderstood. Thank you.
Okay, great. So that's that's kind of the long and short of the areas where we're looking for feedback. And again, if you think of anything or want to provide me anything longer form or just have a conversation, please feel free to email me. Staff has my contact info, or happy to provide it to you. I thought I thought I had a slide for next steps. Maybe we kind of covered that to begin with, but yeah, so essentially this is the beginning of our feedback process. We're going to take what we learn here and come back before you in, I think we said March, with sort of a formal conceptual report, at which point we're going to present that and ask for your blessing, ask for your approval on that. So, good. Any questions, comments?
Anybody?
Yeah. So I would propose that since we can't do a minimum parking space, we would require a single level 2 EV charging station per unit, along with a paved space adjacent, at least 8-foot width by 16-foot length, which is accessible by an electric vehicle.
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah. So because we can't require parking minimums, what I'm saying is that we should instead require that every dwelling unit within those multifamily have a level 2 EV charging station, along with a paved space adjacent to that charging station of at least 8 foot in width and 16 feet in length, which is accessible by an electric vehicle.
Okay.
And if that was a motion, I would second that. I don't know if I can.
Well, it's not hearing yet. I'm just,
Yeah, I would agree.
you draw a line and we'll be on whichever side of it's appropriate, so.
So if you had a multi-unit development, then no, there'll just be one EV charging unit for that multifamily.
No, per unit.
Oh, per unit?
Per dwelling unit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, just to clarify, since we're having a discussion, could you park in it if you're not charging?
That's up to the property owner, I think.
Okay, would we be calling it a parking space?
No,
So it's a charging space.
It's a charging
It's not a
station
parking space,
with
okay.
an adjacent space which is accessible by an electric vehicle.
Yeah, it's not a parking spot.
Right.
It's a charging station.
Correct.
And you're saying that that's a requirement, that's a must?
Yep. I like it too.
See if it sticks.
I wouldn't go that far. I think we're going too far.
And so that would apply to multifamily with 5 units or more and to mixed use where there's 5 units or more?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, but I think the slide that was missing was just a really high overview of what our schedule is. So as I mentioned at the beginning, public engagement, which is more just kind of public information, getting this out there between now and then the end of February. And then, like Brian mentioned, we'll be back early March to tell you what we heard, and we'll put our heads together and figure out a way to wrap all your comments into what we take out to the public. And then the first legislative hearing in March, and then just kind of continue on with the legislative hearings. So the code should go into effect by June of this year, if we keep on our schedule. I'd like to keep on our schedule because I've requested a number of extensions, and I'm not sure how many more they'll give me. So that's our next step. So we'll see you back here with more information on this in March.
I appreciated the desktop format for the presentation so that you could see everything at once, as opposed to having something, behind, pages. Oh. Because you forget what's on the other previous pages, and so it's easy to, when you get a whole cloud view of the entire conceptual framework, it really makes it a lot easier to understand what's going on. Even though there's a lot of information, I think it's easier to digest.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that feedback.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you guys, and feel free to reach out offline with any other questions or comments or whatever. I'll certainly take I'm very curious to know what they say. If you hang up a no parking sign,
I don't want you to ask. Parking. I just want to put it in the code.
Yeah. That's the only way it'll work.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Yes, so communications. So a couple of things to update you on. Let's see, we will be back here at the end of the month for our second meeting. The Tumwata Master Plan will be coming before you, as Mr. Nacita indicated. We have a legislative amendment to add some language to our floodplain overlay ordinance district, and we'll go into a little more explanation of what that's all about at that meeting. Some of you may have heard me talking before the meeting, but we had a number of applicants for Planning Commission since the last round of interviews. The City Commission hasn't scheduled the next round of interviews yet. So hopefully we get that on a calendar soon, and we will have our vacancies filled. another just kind of piece of business, they are finally going to come into this room and make some actual acoustic modifications. And so starting on the 16th, our city recorder was able to find kind of the only window where there's not a meeting in this room. And they're supposed to be done on the 26th. Our meeting's on the 27th. So we may have to meet in City Hall. And I don't know if those acoustics are any better, but I hear they are. Anyway, be prepared that we may not.
Down there.
What's that?
Sure. They're definitely better.
They're definitely,
down there,
okay.
for sure.
I'm sure you've all had experiences where your project doesn't end right on time. So I'm not sure we're going to be in here on the 27th. So stay tuned for that. And then the final piece of information are all of your hard work has paid off, and the Park Place Concept Plan Code was adopted, and the second reading went through just last week on January 7th. So that is in place. One of the major changes that came out of the city commission hearings was the alleys. It's a little bit nuanced. So let me see if I can explain it properly. But there was some public testimony similar to what you had heard throughout the hearings about requiring alleys and the difficulty in constructing alleys. So the city commission had asked, can staff go back and find a threshold between where geologic hazard starts in terms of slopes and completely flat land? So I think the geohazard starts at like 25% slope. So we went back and looked at all of the concept plan area and all of the slopes. And there are definitely flat areas, and some of the flat areas are already developed, like along Livesey, where you would expect it. It's, you know, there's houses along there. The Trailview neighborhood, pretty much flat. The other flat areas were surrounded by sloped areas. And so when you kind of looked at a map and saw like a bullseye as the flat, no sloped area, but you'd have to go through slopes to get there, it didn't really make sense of what that threshold would be. How would we determine when you wouldn't build an alley, especially if you have to go through a sloped area to then build an alley? So we just took that completely out of the code. And there wasn't any argument or pushback on that idea. So that was the main one. There was a couple other minor little tweaks to the neighborhood commercial. We clarified that we meant a pet hospital and not just any old hospital. And we took out, what did we take out, Pete? I think we took out another piece of animal services. So I think you can have a vet clinic and a vet hospital, but you can't have like vet daycare or something like that.
That's right. So you couldn't have just a daycare in the neighborhood commercials, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those were really it. So, I mean, that's a lot of work that you all did from May to September and resulted in kind of those two changes.
How did the roofing profiles end up?
The roofing profiles?
Yeah, what kind of roofs are allowed?
Nothing changed from what you approved, from what you recommended for approval, right. So. Yep. So I think those were the main things that I wanted to cover under communications.
I guess that's meeting adjourned.
Recording stopped.